The United Nations has a new report. This is put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Now, by the way, this is a body that has been discredited for putting out bogus data, bogus reports that have been called into question because of all kinds of shenanigans. So this latest report is nothing more than a new effort to whoop up climate fear. Why? Because as with COVID, fear is a great political motivator. Fear makes you do things you wouldn't otherwise do. Now, let's look in a sober way at what this report is saying. It's got hundreds of pages of documentation, most of it generated from so-called climate models. So the idea of a climate model is that you put in data, and of course, it all depends on what data you put in. And then you extrapolate the data over generally a longer period of time. So for example, you can put in data from, let's say, 1970 to the present. That would be data carefully calculated to show warming, because there was substantial warming between the 70s and the 90s, although not so much since then, but you can show warming over a 50-year period. Of course, if you went 50 years back, you would then find the data pointing in some cases in the opposite direction toward global cooling. And so the climate activists don't put that data in. They choose their date carefully to generate the result that they want, to maximize the extrapolation, so to speak. It's kind of like saying that, you know, your kid grew 3 inches in the past year, and therefore extrapolating that out, when he turns 70, he's going to be like 35 feet tall. It's a lot of times a model is garbage in, garbage out. That's a term actually from science called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. It means that the result you get at the end of an extrapolation is totally influenced by what you put into the sausage machine in the first place. Now, according to these UN scientists, they say that the Earth's temperature has gone up by 1.5 degrees. They say that that this is the fastest rise in the past 50 years than they've seen before. Now, what's funny is the way that this report, 1.5 degrees, and by the way, if you went further back, let's say to a century, you'd find pretty much the same. The Earth is warmed 1.5 degrees because prior to that, there was some warming, then there was some cooling. The warming and cooling appears to occur somewhat cyclically. It came up in my conversation with Dr. Neil Frank, I guess last week or the week before it was, where we talked about how in the 1970s, the big rage among the very same climate activist community was over global cooling. So is the Earth warming? Is it cooling? The truth of it is it depends on where you look. It depends on which decades you choose. Now, you can't say this is obviously due to carbon dioxide, because the levels of carbon dioxide that human beings have been putting into the atmosphere have consistently been going up since the Industrial Revolution, for about 150 years. So the trends toward warming and cooling can't be tracked to that alone. There's got to be other factors involved. Now, I love the way that CNN reports on this UN climate stuff. A quote, "As the world battles historic droughts, landscape-altering wildfires," there's no wildfire that doesn't alter the landscape, "and deadly floods, a landmark report from global scientists says the window is rapidly closing." The window is rapidly closing. I love these phrases. I mean, since I came to the United States in the 1970s, the window has been closing. It's been closing on food, it's been closing on population, it's been closing on the ozone layer, it's been closing on one thing or another. And here's Michael Mann, one of the biggest sort of climate scamsters there is around. He's the lead author of the IPCC's 2001 report. He goes, "Bottom line is we have 0 years left to avoid dangerous climate change." So this is, people aren't buying it, and so they have to keep whipping up the alarm. I continue with CNN. He said, CNN talks about the, quote, "breakneck pace at which the climate has really been warming." Really? You consider 1.5 degrees a breakneck pace? And then it says that by 2050, I'm not quoting CNN, global temperature will still peak above the 1.5 degree threshold before falling. Wait. So this is not a consistent warming. It's apparently a warming that's supposed to go till 2050, and then the Earth is going to start cooling again. So I guess the idea is that we are facing a panicky window over the next 20 years. We've got to give up our lifestyle, stop doing this, stop doing that, stop driving cars, stop using fossil fuels. This is all a huge racket. In some ways, it reminds me of a racket that certain kind of fundamentalist preachers have going, in which they're always predicting the end of the world. It's kind of like, listen, you haven't really been tithing recently. Pretty much turn over all your finances to us and don't worry about it. The world is coming to an end really soon. So you're not going to need all that cash. And so, this is a phenomenon, the end of the worldism, let's call it. I mean, it's been going on for centuries. When the calendar showed 999 AD, people were like, oh my God, we're approaching 1000 AD. The world is going to come to an end. Remember, there was some of this fever at the turn of the millennium, millennial fever. Oh, there's going to be a catastrophe around the corner. I remember reading the late great Planet Earth. Oh, the Earth's gonna, there's going to be global conflict. The Antichrist is going to, and so all of this. Now the left laughs at this stuff. Oh, you crazy fundamentalists! These wacky predictions, all this end of the worldism. Except climate change is the secular equivalent of that. And it is equally a kind of racket aimed at getting us to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do. These people have an uninterrupted history of being wrong. Every single prediction pretty much that they've made has not come to pass. They can't even call it global warming because then they're stuck with cooling. And so the term climate change is intended to cover all their bases. I mean, the climate's always going to be changing in some way. The way for it not to change would be to remain exactly the same forever. It's not going to do that. So climate change is pretty much a waste. It is the most unscientific of theories because it makes no valid predictions. Its history of prophecy is essentially a dead letter. And we can safely disbelieve all this nonsense and continue about our normal business. Yeah, if the sky's falling, give us a call when it actually happens.